It's 2:17 a.m. in the Persian Gulf. The silence is broken by a sudden alert inside an American destroyer. A radar operator freezes for a second before shouting, "Multiple launches detected!" In a matter of seconds, the sky transforms into lines of fire. Ballistic missiles pierce the darkness towards strategic targets. On the other side, in Iranian territory, sirens blare as anti-aircraft systems are activated. Troops take up positions, military communications are disrupted, satellites detect mass movements. And then, in less than 5 minutes, the whole world goes on alert, because this is not just another conflict. It's the type of event that can trigger a global chain reaction. But here's the point that almost nobody understands. A war between the United States and Iran would not be confined to the Middle East. It would spread, and fast, because this is not just a confrontation between two nations. It is a clash between global interests, military alliances, and extremely fragile economic dependencies. Now think about this for a second. Nearly 20% of all the oil consumed on the planet passes through a single, extremely vulnerable point, the Strait of Hormuz. And Iran has the real capability to block that route. If that happens, the impact would not be gradual. It would be immediate. Oil prices would skyrocket. Stock markets around the world would plummet. Entire economies would enter crisis mode. But this is still just the beginning, because behind this potential war lies a tension that has been building up over decades. A rivalry shaped by revolutions, sanctions, military interventions, and indirect confrontations. On one side, the United States, the greatest military power in modern history. On the other side, Iran, a country that has developed a strategy based on resistance, asymmetric warfare, and regional influence through allies and militias. And among them, there is an invisible line, a line that has already been tested several times. And that at any moment, it can be crossed irreversibly. Now comes the question that really matters. If this war started tomorrow, what would happen in the first 24 hours? Because it wouldn't be an isolated attack. It would be a coordinated sequence of events. Military bases being hit simultaneously. Defense systems are being activated in several countries. Allies being automatically dragged into the conflict, and financial markets reacting in real time, with sharp falls and widespread panic. Now imagine waking up and seeing the price of fuel doubling, companies collapsing, and governments are declaring a state of emergency. This is not fiction. This scenario has been dangerously close to happening several times, and each new tension brings us even closer to that point. But there is something even more worrying. This war would not be fought only with tanks and airplanes. It would involve massive cyber attacks, infrastructure sabotage, drones, indirect attacks, and simultaneous conflicts in different regions of the planet. i.e., there wouldn't be a single front line. It would be a distributed conflict, unpredictable. It is extremely difficult to control, and this brings us to the most critical point of all. This war could start quickly, but it wouldn't have a clear end. But calm down, because what you've seen so far is still just the surface. In the next segment, you'll understand exactly how this war would really begin, and what the first targets would be in the opening hours of the conflict. Everything starts fast, too fast for any real attempt at containment. Unlike traditional wars, where there is a gradual escalation with weeks of visible tension, here, the first attack would come with full force, without clear warning. No room for negotiation. In the first few hours, the United States would immediately activate its entire military structure in the region. Bases in the Persian Gulf would enter a state of maximum alert. Aircraft carriers, already strategically positioned, would begin launching aircraft. Anti-missile systems would be activated at various points simultaneously. But Iran would not wait to react. That is the fundamental difference. The Iranian strategy is not based on defense, but on a simultaneous and distributed response, i.e., while one attack is happening, several others are already underway. Ballistic and cruise missiles would be launched against American bases in the Middle East. Military installations in allied countries, such as Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, would become immediate targets. And this generates an almost instantaneous effect. The conflict ceases to be bilateral and becomes regional. But it doesn't end there, because Iran has built over decades a network of influence that extends far beyond its borders. Allied groups spread across different countries could spring into action within hours, and that completely changes the battlefield. Indirect attacks would begin to emerge in unexpected places. Smaller bases, logistics convoys, and even trade routes could be affected. Oil tankers would be threatened in the Gulf, and the global flow of energy would begin to suffer real disruptions. Now think about the impact of this. In less than 24 hours, the price of oil would rise aggressively. Financial markets around the world would go into freefall. Investors would react with panic, and governments would be forced to make emergency decisions. But there is an even more critical point. The United States could not ignore these attacks, and that would lead to an inevitable answer, a massive and coordinated response. Precision airstrikes would begin targeting strategic installations inside Iran. Military command centers, missile launch infrastructure, air defense systems, and possibly facilities linked to the nuclear program. And it is precisely here that the risk skyrockets, because, from that point on, there is no turning back. Every attack generates a response. Each response amplifies the conflict, and each new action dramatically increases the likelihood of escalation. Now comes the part that almost no one considers. What if other countries are dragged into this? Allies of the United States could be automatically involved, and global powers would begin to position themselves, perhaps not with direct troops, but with strategic support, intelligence, or political pressure. And it is at this moment that a regional conflict begins to transform into something much bigger. But there's more. While all this is happening on the military field, a silent war begins in parallel. Massive cyber attacks, electrical systems being knocked down, compromised communication networks, banks, airports, and critical infrastructure are being affected. And the impact of that is devastating, because even countries that aren't directly involved would start to feel the effects. Now imagine this on a global scale: financial chaos, logistical disruptions, widespread uncertainty, and all of this in less than 24 hours. But the most impressive part is yet to come, because those first few hours wouldn't be the peak of the crisis. These would only be the beginning. In the next segment, you'll understand how this conflict can spiral completely out of control and drag the world into a scenario that few are prepared to face. If the first 24 hours were already going to be chaotic, the following days would be even more unpredictable. Because from that point on, the war ceases to be about initial attacks and becomes about strategic survival. The United States would dramatically intensify its air campaign. Continuous, coordinated bombing raids aimed at completely neutralizing Iranian military capabilities. Bases, missile launch systems, command centers, critical infrastructure, everything would become a priority target. But here's the problem that changes everything. Iran was prepared precisely for this type of scenario. Unlike countries that rely on centralized military structures, Iran has decentralized its response capabilities over the course of decades. Hidden facilities in mountainous areas, mobile launchers that are difficult to detect, underground networks designed to withstand intense attacks, i.e., even under constant bombardment. The ability to react does not disappear, and this turns the war into something prolonged, exhausting. It is extremely difficult to control. Now imagine this happening while the Strait of Hormuz begins to be partially blocked. Sea mines being laid, ships being attacked, constant military presence in the region. The result is immediate. The global flow of oil is beginning to be strangled, and the impact of this goes far beyond the battlefield. Countries that are highly dependent on imported energy enter a crisis almost instantly. Inflation surges globally, transportation costs are skyrocketing, and supply chains begin to break down. But that's not even the worst-case scenario, because there's a point where everything can escalate even further. The indirect involvement of major powers, countries like China and Russia, wouldn't just stand by and watch, even without directly entering the conflict. They have deep strategic interests in the region: energy, geopolitical influence, global balance of power. And that means one thing: war ceases to be merely military and becomes geopolitical on a global scale. Indirect support is starting to emerge. Technology supply strategic, intelligence. Diplomatic pressure, preventive, military movements. All of this increases the risk of indirect confrontation between powers, and this is exactly the type of scenario that historically has led to much larger conflicts. Now it adds yet another, even more complex layer. While all this is happening on the military field, entire populations are beginning to feel the direct impact. Refugees crossing borders, cities living under constant tension. Healthcare systems under pressure. Governments trying to maintain internal stability at any cost. But there is something even quieter and more dangerous: psychological warfare, mass misinformation, strategic propaganda, manipulating narratives on a global scale, social media being used as a battleground, and this creates an environment where the truth becomes difficult to identify and fear begins to spread rapidly. Now imagine the effect this would have on the entire world: people rushing to stock up on food, markets reacting to rumors, decisions are being made based on uncertainty, and this amplifies the chaos even further. But there is a critical point where everything converges: the risk of error, because the more complex the conflict, the greater the chance of failure, the greater the chance of errors. Misinterpretations, hasty answers, decisions made under extreme pressure. And in history, this is exactly how wars get completely out of control. Now imagine an attack being interpreted as something much bigger than it actually was, or a disproportionate response to a limited threat. In this scenario, seconds make a difference, and the consequences could be irreversible. But a question begins to arise at this point: how far can this go? Because if this conflict continues to escalate, there is a limit, a point where the war ceases to be regional and transforms into something much bigger, something that would affect the entire planet all at once. And that's exactly what we're going to explore in the next segment: the worst possible scenario and the real impact of this on the world. If all of this already seems extreme, the worst-case scenario is yet to come, because there comes a point where this conflict ceases to be just a regional war, and it transforms into a global event, irreversible, uncontrollable. It is the moment when multiple interests collide at the same time. The United States is intensifying large-scale attacks, Iran maintaining continuous resistance, even under extreme pressure, oil ruptures, compromised, unstable global markets, and international powers are being forced to take a stand. This is where the world enters a state of maximum tension. Now, imagine the following scenario: miscalculation, an attack that was misinterpreted, or a more aggressive response than expected, and suddenly other countries become directly involved in the conflict. What was once a regional war is beginning to expand rapidly. Military alliances are activated, troop movements are increasing in different regions, and the possibility of a confrontation between great powers is no longer just a theory. But the most devastating impact would not be solely in the military field. It would be part of the global economy. With the Strait of Hormuz compromised, the price of oil could reach historic Low energy is becoming scarce, fuel prices soar, and this affects absolutely everything global. Transportation is slowing down, industrial production suffers, disruptions, and the cost of living is rising aggressively. Now imagine supermarkets with empty shelves. Companies are scaling back, operations. Countries entering deep recession, and millions of people are being directly affected. But that's not the limit yet, because there is an even more critical scenario: the risk of escalation involving major powers, not necessarily with an immediate direct confrontation, but with increasing involvement, indirect military support, strategic pressure, and movements that increase global tension. And this is the kind of scenario that completely changes the nature of war. Because from that point on, it's not just about winning anymore. The goal is to avoid a global collapse. Now back to the initial question: what would happen if a war between the United States and Iran started? The answer is simple, and at the same time extremely worrying. It wouldn't just be another conflict, it would be an event with immediate global impact: military, economic, social, psychological, and above all, unpredictable. Because wars of this type don't follow scripts. They evolve rapidly, they climb without warning, and often they get completely out of control. But here is the most important point of all: this scenario has not yet occurred, and to understand how it could develop, that is precisely what allows leaders and nations to try to prevent it from happening. Because, in the end, the greatest wars in history did not begin by chance. They started with decisions, due to mistakes, for moments that could have been different. And maybe this could be exactly one of those moments. If you want to continue understanding how global conflicts really work and the real impact they have on the world, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications, because here you don't just watch, you understand what's really at stake.